This is the Authentic Change Podcast, and I am Mike Horne. Authenticity reflects what we want from each other and our organizations. Open communication, trust, community, fun, and opportunity. I want to help you to do your best in your personal and professional relationships. This podcast delivers expertise, insights, and approaches on authentic leadership. To live your purpose, to lead from your values, to establish connected relationships, to steward people and culture change, to build and sustain prosperity, and to open doors and possibilities. This podcast will assist you in paving the way forward to personal, team, and organizational prosperity. Welcome to another edition of the Authentic Change Podcast. I am so delighted to have today in our virtual studio, Dr. Rajesh Kumar. And Raj, or Dr. Kumar, or Rajesh, as you prefer, he has an amazing background, and I know will be such a blessing and an inspiration to our audience in terms of thinking about the concepts of authentic leadership in a global, multicultural, and even in a unicultural context. So, Dr. Rajesh Kumar, I'm so delighted that you're here. Would you be able to introduce yourself and say a few words to our audience, please?
Sure, I will. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you. So originally, I'm from India, and I've lived in the United States for 20 plus years, and in England, Denmark, France, Finland, Netherlands, and New Zealand for about 15 all combined. Originally, I'm from India, so I have a multicultural background. And over the years, as I lived in various parts of the world, and I met a wide variety of people, not just business people, students, travelers, individuals who have been living elsewhere for a variety of different reasons. You know, I came to recognize, and given that I have a business background and from a business standpoint, that especially in the global village that we live today, and with a lot of businesses transacting across borders, in the 80s, the emphasis was on Japan. Now it has shifted to China. And so I think one of the things which has been constant is the cultural barrier. And some individuals and some companies have done well in terms of dealing with this. Others have not so. And this, I think, becomes a challenge, certainly for individuals and companies crossing cultural boundaries. So that's been my expertise. I've written in this area. I have taught in this area, and I've advised and done coaching for individuals and companies seeking to cross national boundaries. And I cannot really emphasize the importance of this. And Mike, you mentioned about authentic leadership. And I think one has to recognize that that leadership in other cultures might look very different. Sure. And I think we might all want authentic leadership, but the way that we get to it is indeed a little different. So I hope that gives you some idea of my background.
I need to know more, as does our audience.
Yeah.
What took you around the world? You left India. I know you went to California, New York. What took you around the world?
Well, that's a good question. So originally, I left India in the mid-70s. I wanted to explore new opportunities, new pastures, new ways of doing things. And in the middle 70s, now India has changed, but at that time, you didn't really have a lot of opportunities other than getting into the bureaucracy. So my father was a bureaucrat, and that's not something that really enamored me too much. So I went to England, tried to become an article clerk or an accountant,
right?
But I realized that was not to my taste. So then I moved to the US, came here as a student, did my MBA and then enrolled in a PhD program at Stern School of Business. So I've taught in the United States in various business schools. I've lived in England for 6 years, in Denmark for 9 years, in France for 1 year, in Finland for 1 year, and in Netherlands for about a few months. And in New Zealand. So what took me was initially it was my interest to explore other opportunities, and then one thing led to another.
That's amazing.
It's hard to put it in a linear narrative.
Yeah.
Things happen, events occur, opportunities arise, and you go in that particular direction.
And when you went, and when you did your doctorate at NYU,
yes,
it was in the area of
international business.
International business.
So actually, my thesis in the 80s, there was a lot of focus on Japan in the United States. There were a lot of Japanese companies here entering here, and Americans were struggling how to deal with Japanese culture and all of it. So I focused on understanding the cultural differences in the approaches to American and Japanese approaches to negotiations.
Amazing. And as you think about leadership and leading people in teams, in larger divisions and organizations, what are some of your observations? I mean, given your unique set of experiences relative to leadership, and what are some of those perspectives?
I think one thing which is very important is in terms of building a strong relationship.
Right.
And the difference is that, of course, at one level, relationships are important in every culture.
Right.
But I think in Asian cultures, people pay much greater attention to it. And there are strong do's and not do's in terms of developing it. So I think there has to be that relational orientation, which is very, very important. And if you're able to do it, then you can achieve wonders. If not, then I think you might stumble, you might struggle, and you might have all kinds of problems. And the relational orientation actually it actually exists, in most cultures, even in Latin America, in Middle East, even in Asia. And I think this is one of the things that Northern American and Europeans often struggle in terms of building relationships, because it requires a lot of time and investment. And the question is, are you willing to make that commitment? So that's number one. And I think relationship is very important, because without this, you're not going to have the kind of trust. And without that, you're not going to be able to motivate people or to lead people in the right direction or in the right way. So your employees might give you lip service, but they might not actually follow you.
Yeah, engage, connect in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is, when you're doing business overseas, I think you've got to have a much more longer term perspective in mind. And I think you have to demonstrate to the other party commitment. And this commitment is absolutely essential, again, in terms of building trust, building rapport, and in terms of showing that you're really in it for the long term, and you're not just simply, you're here for a short time and go away. So I'll give you one example. A few weeks ago, I was on the webinar. I was leading a webinar on negotiating across cultures. And so I had this woman who lives in the US now. She works for a university, but she's from Argentina. And so she was saying one of the challenges that people in Latin America face with the rotational policies of American corporations is, so the same corporation may be operating in Argentina for 10 years, but every year or two they have a different manager. of every couple of years. And for the Argentinians, that meant, so even though the company has been there for a long time, it means building the relationship anew.
So across cultures, relationships are enacted differently.
Yeah, correct.
And at the heart of your experience, though, you believe that relationships are core or fundamental to leading people in any way.
I believe so. And I think related to relationships, I would bring in the concept of emotional attunement. Because I think that is very critical. Now, any relationship, personal or otherwise, has that emotional attunement. I'm not saying that in a business sense, it needs to be at that level as it is in a personal relationship. But I do think that you do need to have some level of emotional attunement, even in a business sense.
Sure.
Because if that is not there, then, I think you can talk, we can exchange words, we can have a nice dialogue. But if there is no emotional attunement, you're not creating the foundation for a long-term relationship.
Right. And given that relationships are so fundamental to the exercise of leadership, why do we seem to have such a struggle, particularly in, North America?
Well, I think part is it's a kind, I would say, short-term orientation. Yes. And you have a lot of turnover, people coming in and going. And the pressure is to produce short-term results. Yes. And producing short-term results may not be consistent with long-term results. Yes.
Right.
So I think one is an institutional barrier.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you take a look at Japanese or other companies, they have a much more longer time horizon. So if you don't, whereas here, I think if you miss your earnings by even a cent, I think it's going to impact your stock price. And so I think the short-term orientation, dominance, of course, also financial capital, which comes into this picture. So that's one thing. Partly, I think it's also to some extent cultural, so business and there's a separation between the business and the personal side of things. And people, have a segmentation between the two. So the kind of things that you need to do in many Asian cultures, which is spend a lot of time with people together, a lot of socializing, playing golf or drinking or whatever. I mean, for American managers who have their own family and all of this, I think that might eat into their time. So I think there's a cultural element that also comes into play.
Yes, absolutely. And given how much time American managers spend at work, why don't we get this relationship question straight?
I think it's just a cultural thing, which is that that work is all about getting various projects done. You
Production.
Move from project 1, project 2. Yeah, it's a kind of a manufacturing model mentality, if you might say so. Yes.
Yes.
Whereas I think in other cultures, especially in Asia, it's a symbiosis. It's a kind of a systemic thing, and you're working collectively in some sense. And I think it's a very, very different mindset in terms of how you really approach things. Now, I'm not saying that is all systems have their strengths and weaknesses. Yes. So from an American standpoint, you get strong direction, you get accountability, you get immediate results. Yes. So a lot of focus on outcomes. Yes. Whereas in other cultures, of course, that is there, but there's the larger context. So that might lead in some cases to inefficiency, to to other kinds of problems. So a lot of Japanese companies, I was just talking to a Japanese cross-cultural consultant the other day. He was saying they're still struggling with issues of diversity. And there are not many non-Japanese who are CEOs of Japanese companies. So they have their own particular unique challenges. But, I mean, no system is perfect. Every system has advantages and disadvantages.
And I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And as we think about, relationships and integrity and leadership.
Yes.
When I think about integrity, I think about congruency. And I think about the alignment between thoughts, words, and actions, that my behaviors follow my words and my words follow what I believe in my thoughts. And it's that kind of congruency among thoughts, words, and actions that creates a kind of happiness.
Right.
And it's not the kind of happiness that's associated with the birth of a child or a new boyfriend or girlfriend, but it's a sort of sustained happiness. And I think, as you know, I mean, we know from social science research that people enjoy working with happy people.
Correct, yes.
And I'm wondering, in your experience, I mean, given that you've observed leaders in so many cultural contexts,
yes,
what do you think about that in terms of delivering, producing, creating effectiveness?
Sure. So I think that may also be somewhat culturally dependent.
Yes.
And the question, of course, so two things. One, you have to ask yourself, is happiness a relevant construct across cultures? Yes.
Uh-huh.
And second, even if it is relevant, then do the same kinds of things give happiness or not?
Right.
So let's assume for a sense that that's a relevant construct, although there can be a whole huge debate or discussion about that. But for the purposes of it, let us just make that assumption. And here I think I would say is that even if that is the case, the way you do that, or the way you achieve that is very different. So in hierarchical cultures, such as in China, Japan, or in India, it's pretty much a top-down communication, yes? And I think it's, and subordinates have to be very careful in terms of what they say or they don't say. And in particular, in Asia, the importance of face is very important.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of things that happen in the Asian context happen in an informal setting, whether you are outside of the regular meeting. It's not going to happen in a formal sense. The formal meeting is only perhaps the codification of what may have happened, what may have been agreed upon informally. Yes? So two things here. One, in terms of happiness, I think, of course, every culture, I think, values respect, but how you do that is in fact different.
Sure.
And so I think subordinates need to be very careful how they say what they say. And I think even the leaders then have to respond to their employees' concern in a more informal way. Yeah.
So for you, these differences have at times appeared in stark contrast.
Sure. Yes.
I think about consulting and living in other, in places other than the U.S. I mean,
yes.
When I've consulted in Japan, Malaysia,
yes.
New Zealand,
yes.
differences are so, they're in contrast, right?
They are, yes.
Sometimes you get tripped up, I mean, as an American in other English-speaking countries. And,
yes.
And so much, given that English is often the lingua franca of the business world. But the contrasts are stark. When you're consulting in Tokyo, I mean, it's a whole different, world, and you become aware of it mostly through the language choices, and you're less able to make assumptions about culture.
Yes.
So what's your experience in this regard about when you're consulting or when you're trying to help people work more effectively together? What are some of the observations or distinctions that you can make based on your experiences? I mean, how do we help people coming from different cultures cultural situations?
So I think, first of all, because there has to be a genuine motivation on part of different companies, different people from different cultures to try to manage this difference. I think one of the challenges I've observed is that people get locked into an my mindset, your mindset attitude.
Right.
Yeah. So our group, your group. And then that actually becomes very difficult and very problematical, because then, you start discussing about we should do it our way, your way, or and that creates a different dynamic. So one of the things that I've seen is that at times companies say they want to do something, and yet because they're not emotionally attuned, either as an organization or as individuals, they may do some training programs, but their heart is not there.
Right.
And if your heart is not there in terms of what you're doing, I mean, I can give you a great PowerPoint presentation about how different cultures are. But if you're not emotionally attuned to it, I think it'll just it'll be a waste of time. So that's one thing I've noticed, that at times there's been that there's been a reluctance to actually deeply engage.
And it's one thing is, I think about American organizations as they move to transnationalism, right? I mean, usually the first extensions are into Canada, then into the UK. I mean, these are fairly typical, ploys for American companies on their transnational journeys, and then expanding into a multinational journey. Often with in the EU, and then thinking about what it means to be a global enterprise. Do you think there are differences in leadership that are required as organizations move from national to transnational to multinational to global?
Absolutely. I mean, you need to create a much more inclusive environment. You need to respect differences.
Yes.
You need to respect those differences, not just acknowledge them, but also respect them.
Right.
And you've got to create programs and places and policies and mechanisms that will allow for the diversity to actually flourish. I think that is the most important thing, because, in multicultural teams, if they're not managed well, they can be hugely unproductive.
Do you find differences in that regard? So, I think about, for example, working in Japan, you will find a lot of homogeneity in some cases, right? Yes. I mean, you meet with the team, all the young men go out to drink, after the meeting. And,
absolutely.
It's very different. And yet, in the US and in Canada and many other places in parts of the EU, you will find multicultural teams within the same organization.
Yeah, you will. Yes, absolutely.
In India as well, right? I mean, you can go to Bangalore. You've got people from all over India in Bangalore. Still with the traffic problems.
Yes.
But what is it that, what does a leader, you've got such a unique perspective on this. How does a leader, even in his or her own or their own cultural context, attend to the diversity, all the items that you discussed, Rajesh Kumar, that are so important, respect and
emotional. So I think the leader has to have some unique skills in terms of being able to manage this particular diversity.
Yes.
So, there's been a lot of discussion about emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, and all of this. So I think the leader has to be one who can inspire people. The leader has to be one who can actually, acknowledge these differences and actually highlight the positivity of these differences in terms of how, this could make the company or the organization a more stronger one than might have been the case otherwise.
That's a big leap for many leaders to make the step from appreciation to working with differences.
No, of course. But, I think if you're going to do business in China and you want to be successful, or India, I think you've got to learn to how to relate to the locals. Or even if not the CEO, you've got to have people in your organizations who can actually do that.
So we come back to these ideas of relationship and emotional attunement.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an example. So when I lived in Finland many years ago, so in India, nobody has heard of Finland at that time. And now maybe they have, I'm not sure.
Well, same as the United States, nobody's heard of Finland.
And so anyway, so India had opened up in 1991, because before that it was a very closed market.
Right.
And so you have this Finnish company in the mid-90s. I won't mention the name of the company.
Sure.
They were seeking to enter the Indian company, to the Indian market. And so I met this gentleman. I had long exchanges of conversations with him. And based on that, I actually also wrote an article for the Asian Wall Street Journal at that time. So he was developing this business in India. And, he was telling me that every month he would spend 2 weeks in India. Every month.
Oh, every month.
Yeah, every month. So, that tells you the amount of commitment.
Investment.
Mm-hmm. Investment that is actually required to develop something.
Right.
Yes. Especially in unfamiliar environments. So, in many of these cultures, face-to-face meeting is vital. And so again, I was talking with someone the other day. He said, because of COVID, they have to deal with people on Zoom, but it's not the same thing.
Right.
It's not yielding the same results, the same kind of outcomes. So the personal, this showed commitment, yes. It showed a willingness. It's a lot, isn't it? 2 weeks every month.
It's quite a bit.
Your country, yes, yeah. And so you go, you come back, and then you prepare for your next trip. And essentially,
yeah, and it has been. I think about people within my own network who, since the pandemic, have been limited in their travels.
Sure. Yes.
So, for example, I know someone right now who has, since February has had entry into China.
Yes.
But they say, well, why am I leaving San Francisco to go to China where I'll be in quarantine for 3 weeks? And then I'll be turning right away and coming home.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what do you believe, Rajesh, around the impact of the global pandemic, or now endemic?
It's huge.
On relationships. What I hear from so many of my executive clients is that the relationships with their teams have survived, the 8 to 10 people that they work with on a regular basis.
Yeah.
What most of them miss in terms of development is the next layer down. It's not that they don't see these people on Zoom calls.
Right. Yeah.
It is that informal, connection with leadership roles that I think is getting shortchanged in some of our...
It is. I was just reading an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day, because Apple does a lot of production in China.
Yes.
So pre-pandemic, they had 50 seats booked, business class, on United Airlines to Shanghai every day.
Surely, yes. Yeah.
So that was the kind of interaction and the face-to-face thing. But of course, the pandemic has changed all of that, and so yes, I mean, I think, and certainly in a nation or in other contexts, I think, but I think now it's beyond the pandemic. I think we're also seeing fissures more broadly in the global economy. Yes.
Yes.
And we're seeing other kind of fractures that are developing, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Say some more about that, Rajesh.
Well, I mean, I think so. There's been a lot of focus on Russia and China recently. Yes. And of course, Russia, we know, but China is there in the background.
Yes.
So...
but it is the Chinese century. I mean, the last century was the American century. This is the Chinese century.
Right. I mean, but that is what's... at a political level, it's making a lot of people nervous.
Yes.
If it is the Chinese century.
Right. If it is,
I don't think we are there as yet. But maybe there's a trajectory there. But if there's a trajectory, it is making a lot of people nervous. Yes.
Yes, very much so.
And so that of course then creates tensions, and so that's one aspect to it. Second is both because of the pandemic and all of these global tensions, I think there's a lot of focus on retreating within oneself.
Yes.
So they're talking about bringing back supply chains to the U.S. or from other countries. There's a shortage of baby formula now, which is very much on everyone's mind in the U.S.
Yes.
Similarly, in India, there are, so with the Russia, India was very heavily dependent on Russian arms.
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
And so now that's become a big problem for India. Yes.
Right.
So they're coming under pressure from the West to de-link with Russia, but they can't do it. It's not easy. And so there's some focus on manufacturing internally and all, but that takes decades. It's not something that can just switch on a light bulb. Won't happen overnight.
Do you much of our work, I'm going to assume or even make a guess, arises out of humanism or humanistic values.
Sure, it does.
Treat everyone with respect and dignity, and recognize that individuals are in the process of development.
Sure.
To grow in diversity to grow inclusion by having diverse ideas and people around you.
Correct. Sure.
Do you think most of the world is attuned that way? I mean, you have a unique perspective on this. Certainly from an employee perspective, we talk about relationships, we talk about attainment, and we know that's different culturally across the world. But I'm fascinated by, how do you think humanism or humanistic values drive the kind of work that we do to make the world a better place?
Right. So, I think, again, there are cultural variations in that. And so this DEI it developed in the US, so it has a very strong resonance here. So you may see aspects of it elsewhere, but I don't think in such a strong form.
Correct. Yeah.
And so, and
the American legacy of slavery, it's really changes our cultural context.
Exactly. So I think there are some unique reasons for why that is arisen here. Now, there are problems in a lot of other cultures and societies, and a lot of, and the issue of diversity is not unique, but I think it is the slavery aspect of it which has given it so much resonance here.
Yes.
And it's a question of equity and inclusion. I think that's, I think at some level it exists everywhere, but not to that degree. And I think if I'm not mistaken, that there's some specific parameters used to assess DEI here.
Yes, I think the justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and it's there is, having worked in a lot of global corporations, I mean, certainly the American voice is speak to inclusion, and there's no one that's going to, usually in business situations, oppose that.
Sure,
but it is a different, it's a different topic depending on what part of the world you're in.
Sure, it is a different topic. Absolutely. Yes.
And as you're, working and consulting, and you've had a life as a teacher, a mentor, a consultant, author, an academic.
Yeah.
What do you think what do we need more of? Particularly in an American context relative to making our organizations more effective?
I think, first, there just needs to be a heightened sense of global awareness, and I think that is still somewhat lacking, even though a lot of American companies are doing business globally.
Yes.
I think that there is still it's still not there to the same extent. So I was just talking to a cross-cultural consultant yesterday, and so she was telling me that most companies think, oh, yes, culture is important in all of this, but they only focus on these issues when there's a problem.
Yes.
And that is too late, yes?
Yeah.
And so I think to begin with, there needs to be a deeper understanding as to how and why this is going to be relevant. And also, I think one has to recognize that even the U.S. workforce is changing. So irrespective of whether or not they go overseas, which of course they have to, is that they're going to have a very diverse workforce now, even in the U.S.
Right.
So which means they've got to really understand where they're coming from and what their motivations might be.
Absolutely.
So the unique paradigm that existed before, so in the 80s, it was even much more insular.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Except Japan was very much there, but it was a very different context.
Right.
And now this is so. I think that is one thing they need to really recognize and appreciate it, and to see the potential value that it can bring to them.
That is what we talk about, right? Is about increasing value to all of the stakeholders in the enterprise.
Right, exactly.
And as we begin to wrap up, Dr. Rajesh Kumar, what I'd love to know is, given your rich background, how would people get in touch with you to further a conversation or to have a discussion?
So they can get in touch with me through my website or through my LinkedIn.
And tell us your website, please.
It's globalstrategicadvisory.com.
globalstrategicadvisory.com.
Yeah.
And that may be one of the best ways to get in touch with Dr. Rajesh Kumar is at
www.globalstrategicadvisory.com.
globalstrategicadvisory.com. And, if you're not at the site, then you can find Rajesh Kumar on LinkedIn.
Yes, sure. Absolutely.
Also where he has an active presence. And what's one of the interesting projects you're working on today, Rajesh?
Right. So, we're trying to look at how, in a number of these partnerships, how culture is coming into play. Because I think that's very, very important. And a lot of companies are forming these alliances and partnerships. And I think the cultural element becomes very, very important. And if not managed effectively, it can create a whole lot of problems and challenges. And so when we talk about culture here, you talk about communication, talk about decision making, you talk about conflict management, you talk about managing expectations.
Yes. And you're working with client systems on those issues?
Right. Yes.
And As you do your work, as strategic advisory does its work, what do you anticipate some of the issues that we'll be consulting on in the next year or so?
So a lot of it might be about business partnerships, yes, and also about negotiations and negotiating global deals.
And as we work through these issues, what advice or guidance would you have for our listeners as you think about the future, about the ability to help other leaders, the ability to coach leaders? What's your advice or guidance, Rajesh, for our effectiveness in the next 12 months?
I think it is very important to be empathetic, to show some compassion, and basically, ultimately, to as I said, and all of it is, I think, related to my notion of emotional attunement.
Yes, this is so great.
I think because that is very vital. If the leader is not emotionally attuned to his or her followers, I think there will be a problem. And you do a lot of work in leadership, and I think, I mean, you need that connection.
Yes.
Do you agree?
I do. And I agree because, and this is where I'll begin to wrap up, is that Rajesh, as we've discussed today, and we have many, listeners to our podcast, it's so insightful, I think, about how important it is to be inclusive and to create community in the workplace.
Sure.
And the urgent traits that you're working, the urgent traits that leaders need to develop. I mean, you're working on this through your, with your work on cross-cultural experiences. And as the CEO and founder of Global Strategic Advisory, certainly you know that managing differences when communicating in a multicultural work environment is so important to everyone's success today, whether you're an individual leader or whether you're at the helm of the enterprise and the enterprise itself. I know from speaking with you, and I hope our audience can be in touch with you about the knowledge that developing cross-cultural skills is one of the most important factors in helping leaders to develop community, to maintain trust with both employees and customers. And I'm so grateful that you've shared some of your insight and knowledge. And again, I would just encourage folks to visit you at globalstrategicadvisory.com. Any concluding comments or advice that you might offer to our listeners, Dr. Rajesh Kumar?
All that I would say is the world is changing, be open to change, and recognize the positivity in the change and use that positivity to become a better company and a better individual.
Thank you so much. What a great note to end on about building positivity to make the world a better and richer place.
Yes.
Thank you again, Rajesh Kumar, Global Strategic Advisory. Happy to have you as a guest. Until our next episode of the Authentic Change podcast, stay well.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe today and tell a friend about our show. If you're looking for hands-on help to increase your success through authentic change, or have a question you'd like to hear me answer here, please email me at mike@mike-horne.com.